It didn't make sense that the only empty seat in first class belonged to the one person everyone assumed didn't belong there, and maybe that's why the silence felt heavier than usual when the woman in the tailored ivory blazer stopped in the aisle, stared down at seat 2A, and said, "You're in my seat," like it was already decided. Danielle Brooks didn't look up right away, not because she hadn't heard, but because she had, and she recognized the tone. The kind that didn't ask questions, the kind that issued verdicts, the kind she'd heard before in conference rooms, in lobbies, in places that smiled on the surface and sorted people underneath. The overhead bins clicked shut one by one, flight attendants moved with practiced calm, and the hum of the aircraft wrapped around the moment like a curtain waiting to drop, but the tension stayed exposed, sharp and quiet, as Danielle finally lifted her eyes, calm, steady, unreadable, meeting the woman's gaze without a flicker of apology. "Boarding pass," the woman added, not requesting, demanding, already reaching as if the paper in Danielle's hand was evidence she had a right to inspect. Around them, a few passengers paused mid-motion. A man in a navy suit adjusted his watch slower than necessary. A young couple across the aisle exchanged a look that said they'd seen something like this before but weren't sure how it would end. Danielle's fingers didn't tighten, didn't resist. She simply held the pass where it was, level. Unmoved, her voice even when she spoke. It scanned at the gate, and that should have been enough. But it wasn't, because the woman's lips curved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, more like certainty dressed as patience. "Then you won't mind if we double-check," she said, already turning to flag down a flight attendant before Danielle could respond. The attendant approached with a polite expression that faded the moment she took in the scene, her eyes flicking from the tailored blazer to Danielle's simple black t-shirt and jeans, measuring, calculating, choosing. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, but her body angled toward the woman standing, not the one seated. "She's in the wrong seat," the woman replied quickly, smoothly, like she'd done this before, like the words had weight simply because she said them, and the attendant nodded just enough to signal agreement before she even reached for the scanner. Danielle didn't shift, didn't gather her things, didn't explain herself further. She just sat there, as if anchored to the seat itself, as if moving too soon would confirm something that wasn't true. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," the attendant said, her tone professional but already edged with doubt, and Danielle handed it over without hesitation, watching as the small device beeped once, a clean, neutral sound that should have settled everything. But the attendant's brow still creased, her eyes lingering a second too long, like she was waiting for the result to match the expectation already formed in her mind. The woman in the aisle exhaled sharply, impatient now, glancing at the line of passengers behind her. "We're holding everyone up," she said, projecting just enough for others to hear, turning inconvenience into pressure, pressure into justification. A man 2 rows back leaned slightly into the aisle, curiosity pulling him forward, while another passenger muttered under his breath, "This always happens," not loud enough to challenge, just loud enough to exist. Danielle's gaze moved slowly from the attendant to the woman, then back again, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, her voice low when she spoke again. "Check the system." 3 words, calm, precise, carrying more weight than the raised voices around her. For a split second, the attendant hesitated, thumb hovering over the device, caught between what she saw and what she'd already decided, and in that hesitation, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, because something about the way Danielle sat there, unmoved, unbothered, certain, didn't fit the story being built around her, and stories like that don't unravel all at once. They crack first, quietly, right before everything changes. The attendant did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the woman in the aisle to shift her weight and cross her arms, long enough for the man in the navy suit to stop pretending he was not watching, long enough for the quiet hum of the cabin to feel like it was waiting for permission to continue. The scanner remained in the attendant's hand, its small screen glowing faintly, reflecting in her eyes as she read something she did not immediately understand or perhaps did not expect, and instead of announcing the result, she glanced back at the woman standing, seeking confirmation where there should have been none. "Well," the woman pressed, her voice sharper now, carrying just enough impatience to pull more attention toward them, and the attendant cleared her throat, her posture tightening as if she had already chosen a side she was now trying to justify. "It is still processing," she said, though the device had already gone still, its single beep long past, and Danielle watched that moment closely, not the words, but the hesitation behind them, the quiet decision to delay clarity. A few seats behind, a young man leaned forward slightly, lowering his phone just enough to whisper to the woman beside him, "It already scanned," and she nodded, eyes narrowing, not convinced by the delay either, but neither of them spoke up. Not yet. The woman in the aisle exhaled again, louder this time, turning halfway toward the people behind her as if to gather support. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said, her tone shifting. From complaint to performance, people sit wherever they want and expect no one to question it, and a low murmur followed. Not agreement exactly, but not resistance either, the kind of sound that allows something wrong to keep going. Danielle remained seated, her hands resting lightly in her lap now, her posture unchanged, but there was something different in her stillness, something more deliberate, as if she had decided not just to stay, but to let the moment unfold exactly as it was. Without interruption, without defense, the attendant finally spoke again, but her voice had softened, uncertain. Can I ask how you were assigned this seat?" And it was the wrong question, not because it lacked logic, but because it shifted the burden, and Danielle recognized that shift immediately, her eyes lifting slightly, steady, unbothered, the same way everyone else was. She replied, calm, direct, leaving no room for interpretation, and for a brief second, the attendant looked as though she might correct course, might simply acknowledge what the scanner had already confirmed, but the woman in the aisle stepped closer instead, closing the gap, her presence pressing into the space like it could override the truth. "Look, this is taking too long," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable. "I paid for this seat, I booked it weeks ago, and I am not standing here all day because someone decided to ignore their boarding group," and the word someone lingered, vague but pointed, and the attendant nodded again, that same subtle alignment. "Let me check with the system manually," she said, though she had already done that, and as she turned slightly toward the galley, another voice finally entered, quieter, hesitant, but clear enough to cut through the noise. "I remember her," a second flight attendant said from a few steps back. "Younger, less certain, but present. She boarded early, her pass scanned green," and the first attendant froze for a fraction of a second, caught between two realities now, one spoken, one implied, and the woman in the aisle turned sharply, her expression tightening. "Are you sure?" she asked, not curious, but challenging, and the younger attendant hesitated, her confidence wavering under the attention. I think so," she said, and that was all it took for the doubt to creep back in, for the certainty to dissolve again, and Danielle saw it happen in real time, the way truth could shrink when questioned just enough. She leaned back slightly into the seat, her gaze moving forward now, past the aisle, past the watching eyes, as if she were no longer focused on proving anything at all, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before, but somehow carried further. "You are not looking for the answer," she said, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone listening. "You are looking for confirmation," and the word settled into the space differently than the ones before them, not loud, not confrontational, but precise, and for the first time, the woman in the aisle did not respond immediately, her mouth parting slightly before closing again, as if the script she had been following no longer fit as cleanly as it had just moments ago. And somewhere in the cabin, the balance shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that a few more eyes began to question what they had assumed, enough that the silence returned, heavier now, but no longer empty. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like pressure building behind something no one could see yet, and the woman in the aisle felt it before she understood it, her posture stiffening, her confidence no longer as smooth as it had been just moments ago, because the room was no longer moving with her, it was watching her. She let out a short, controlled laugh, the kind meant to recover ground. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, louder now, reclaiming volume as if it could restore control. "I have a confirmed seat, I have status with this airline, and I am not about to stand here while this turns into some kind of debate," and the word debate landed awkwardly, because no one had raised their voice, no one had argued, except her. The first attendant shifted her weight again, glancing back toward the front of the cabin where the curtain to the cockpit area hung slightly open, and without another word she stepped away, motioning subtly for the second attendant to follow, their quiet retreat signaling something had moved beyond routine, something now required someone higher, someone with authority to decide what they had hesitated to confirm. Danielle watched them go without turning her head fully, her eyes following just enough to register the change, and then returning forward, calm, unchanged, as if she had expected this exact moment, as if she had seen this sequence play out before in different rooms, with different uniforms, but always the same structure. Behind her, the young man who had been whispering earlier leaned closer to the aisle, his voice no longer as quiet. "If it's scanned green, then what are we even doing?" he said, not aggressive, but clear enough now that others heard him, and this time, Someone answered, a woman across the aisle. Older, composed, we are waiting for someone to admit they made an assumption, and that word settled differently, assumption, because it named something no one had said out loud yet, but everyone had felt. The woman in the aisle turned toward them, her expression tightening again, defensive now. Excuse me, I am not making assumptions, I am protecting what I paid for, she replied quickly, but the sentence did not land the way she intended. Not anymore, because the room had shifted just enough that it sounded less like certainty and more like justification. Danielle adjusted her wrist slightly, not to check the time, but as if grounding herself, her fingers brushing against the edge of her sleeve, and for a brief second, her mind flickered somewhere else, not fully a memory, but a feeling, the weight of standing in spaces where she had been questioned before she was acknowledged, where her presence had required explanation while others passed without pause, and she let that feeling pass through without holding it, without reacting to it, because this moment was not about proving something new, it was about allowing something old to reveal itself clearly. Footsteps returned, measured, heavier this time, and the lead flight attendant appeared from the front, her expression composed but alert, the kind that enters when something has already escalated beyond protocol, her eyes scanning the scene quickly, taking in the standing passenger, the seated one, the quiet crowd that had formed without moving, and she spoke with controlled authority. What seems to be the issue? And before anyone else could answer, the woman in the aisle stepped forward immediately, reclaiming her narrative. She is in my seat, her boarding pass is questionable, and we have already delayed boarding because of it, she said. Faster now, layering urgency into her words. But the lead attendant did not respond right away, her gaze shifting instead to Danielle, holding there a second longer than expected, as if measuring something beyond appearance, beyond assumption, and Danielle met that look without hesitation, steady, grounded, her voice even when she spoke. There is no issue with the seat, she said, simple, direct, and for a brief moment, the noise of the cabin seemed to fall away again, because this time, the decision would not come from hesitation, it would come from someone who had to choose, and everyone could feel it, the moment before a line is drawn, not loudly, but clearly enough that it cannot be undone. The lead attendant did not answer immediately, and that pause carried weight, the kind that makes every person in the room lean in without moving, because now it was no longer about a misunderstanding, it was about a decision, and decisions reveal more than questions ever do. She stepped closer into the aisle, positioning herself between the two women, not blocking, not choosing yet, but defining the space as something she controlled, her voice calm, measured. Let me see both boarding passes. And the request sounded neutral, but it shifted the dynamic in a way everyone could feel, because for the first time, the demand was not directed at Danielle alone. The woman in the aisle hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the people watching to notice, enough for the confidence she had been projecting to flicker, and then she recovered, pulling her pass from her purse with a sharp motion, handing it over as if the gesture itself proved her point. Danielle did not rush, did not mirror the urgency. She simply reached into her seat pocket, retrieved her pass again, and placed it into the attendant's hand with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. No resistance, no performance, just presence. The lead attendant held both passes side by side, her eyes scanning them carefully this time, not glancing, not assuming, actually reading, and the cabin grew quieter with each second that passed, because now there was nothing left to interpret, only something to confirm. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat, lowering his voice as he spoke to no one in particular. This should not be complicated, and someone behind him murmured agreement. The sound soft but steady, like a current beginning to form beneath the surface. The attendant's expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough that the tension tightened instead of easing, her lips pressing together as if she had reached a conclusion she was not entirely comfortable delivering, and when she finally spoke, her tone was still controlled, but no longer neutral. There seems to be a discrepancy, she said, and the word landed heavier than expected, because it did not clarify. It complicated. The woman in the aisle seized it immediately, stepping forward again, reclaiming momentum. Exactly, that is what I have been saying, she replied, her voice rising just enough to sound validated, but the lead attendant raised her hand slightly, not to silence, but to slow, to keep the moment from slipping back into assumption, and then she turned to Danielle, her gaze direct now. Can you explain how you obtained this seat assignment? And there it was again, the same shift, the same subtle transfer of burden, dressed in procedure but rooted in doubt, and the room felt it, a few passengers exchanging looks that said the question itself did not match the evidence already in hand. Danielle did not react immediately. She let the question sit in the air, not ignoring it, but not rushing to answer it either. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. "I did not obtain it," she said, her eyes holding the attendant's without wavering. "It was assigned to me," and the distinction was small in words, but significant in meaning, and for a brief second, the lead attendant's composure shifted, just enough to reveal that she understood exactly what was being said. Behind them, the younger attendant stepped forward slightly, her voice hesitant but firmer than before. "The system did not flag her at the gate," she added. And this time she did not soften it with uncertainty, she let it stand. And that changed something, because now there were two pieces of clarity against one growing assumption. The woman in the aisle let out a sharp breath, her patience thinning. "So what are you saying? That I am wrong?" she asked, but the question no longer carried the same authority. It sounded closer to frustration now, closer to a demand for reassurance than a statement of fact. Danielle shifted slightly in her seat, not to stand, not to move aside, but to sit taller, more present, her gaze moving briefly across the cabin, taking in the faces that had been watching, the ones now questioning, the ones beginning to understand, and then returning to the attendant, her voice quiet but cutting through the noise. "You are not confused," she said, each word placed carefully. "You are choosing to be," and the sentence did not rise, did not accuse loudly, but it landed with a clarity that made the air feel different. Because now the moment was no longer about a seat, it was about a choice. And everyone could feel which side of it they were standing on. The words did not echo, but they settled, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the lead attendant did not immediately respond, her posture still composed but her expression no longer neutral, because what had just been said was not something she could redirect with procedure or soften with policy. The woman in the aisle shifted again, her confidence now edged with irritation, her voice sharper when she spoke. "This is not about choosing anything, it is about following the rules," she insisted, but even as she said it, the statement felt thinner, like it was trying to hold together something already starting to come apart. The lead attendant inhaled slowly, glancing once more at the two boarding passes in her hand, then at the small device clipped to her uniform, and for a moment it seemed like she might finally align her words with the information she had already seen, but instead she stepped slightly to the side and spoke into her headset, her tone low but clear. "I need confirmation on seat assignment 2A, first class. We have a discrepancy," and the word returned again, this time formalized, elevated, as if repeating it could make it more legitimate. Danielle watched that decision without interruption, her gaze steady, not surprised, not frustrated, just aware, because this was the part where systems were called in to support what individuals hesitated to admit, where clarity was delayed in the name of verification. A faint voice responded through the attendant's earpiece, too quiet for the rest of the cabin to hear, and the attendant listened, her expression tightening slightly as she processed the response, but she did not relay it immediately. She held it, as if deciding how much of the truth to release. And when, behind Danielle, the low murmur of the cabin grew more defined, no longer just background noise, but a collection of quiet judgments forming in real time, a man near the window leaned toward his companion. "If they have to call it in, then they already know," he said, and the woman beside him nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the scene. "They just do not want to say it yet," she replied, and those words, though soft, seemed to ripple outward, because they named something everyone was beginning to recognize. The woman in the aisle crossed her arms again, her posture rigid now, less assured, more defensive. "This is unbelievable," she said, louder than before, her voice carrying the strain of losing control. "I fly this route twice a month, I know exactly how this works," and the statement hung there, an appeal to authority, to familiarity, but it no longer held the same weight it had earlier, because experience without accuracy begins to sound like insistence, not truth. Danielle shifted her gaze briefly toward the window, the runway lights visible in the distance, steady, unchanging, a contrast to the shifting tension inside the cabin, and for a moment, her mind drifted, not fully into the past, but into the pattern, the repetition of moments like this, different places, different faces, but always the same question hidden beneath it all: who is allowed to belong without being asked to prove it? She brought her attention back without hesitation, her presence grounding the moment again. And when the lead attendant finally removed her hand from the headset, the cabin seemed to lean forward all at once, waiting, because now there would be an answer, something definitive, something that would either close the gap or widen it completely. The attendant looked first at the woman in the aisle, then at Danielle, and for a brief second, Something like uncertainty passed through her eyes, not about the information, but about the consequence of saying it out loud, and that hesitation said more than any explanation could. Danielle did not move, did not prompt, did not rush the moment. She simply sat there, composed, as if she understood that the truth did not need to be forced, it only needed to be allowed, and in that stillness, the entire cabin felt the shift again. Subtle but undeniable, because the question was no longer what the system would say, it was whether the person holding it would say it the way it was meant to be heard. The lead attendant finally spoke, but not with the clarity the moment demanded, her voice measured, careful. "The system shows both of you associated with this seat," she said, and the sentence landed like a deliberate blur, not a resolution but an extension of uncertainty, and for a split second, the woman in the aisle seized it again, her relief immediate, almost visible. "There, that is exactly what I have been saying," she replied quickly, her tone lifting as if the ambiguity itself proved her right, but the room did not move with her this time, because something about the way the attendant had phrased it felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its ending. Danielle did not respond right away. She let the words settle, let the gap in them become visible, and then she tilted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the attendant, not confrontational, but precise. "Associated how?" she asked, her voice calm. But the question cut through the vagueness instantly, forcing it into something more defined. The attendant hesitated again, a fraction longer this time, her grip tightening slightly around the boarding passes, because now she could not hide behind general language, she had to choose specifics, and specifics have consequences. Behind them, the younger attendant stepped closer, her voice low but firm enough to carry. "Seat 2A is confirmed under Danielle Brooks," she said, and this time she did not soften it, did not question herself, she stated it, clear, direct, and the effect was immediate, the kind of shift that does not need volume to be felt. The woman in the aisle blinked, just once, but it was enough for the first crack to show through her certainty. "That is not possible," she said. "Quieter now, less performance, more disbelief. I have flown this route for years, I always sit here," and the statement revealed more than she intended, because it was no longer about the system, it was about expectation. Danielle leaned back slightly, her posture unchanged, but her presence sharper now, more defined, her voice even when she spoke. "Familiar does not mean entitled," she said, not loudly, not directed with anger, but placed exactly where it needed to be, and the words did not echo, they settled, like a truth that had been waiting to be acknowledged. The lead attendant exhaled slowly, her composure tightening again as she adjusted her stance, the moment slipping from ambiguity into clarity whether she was ready or not. She said, turning to the woman in the aisle, her tone still professional but no longer uncertain, "This seat is assigned to Ms. Brooks," and the sentence, once spoken, changed everything, because it removed the space where doubt had been allowed to exist. The cabin reacted not with noise, but with a subtle release, a collective shift as shoulders relaxed, as glances changed direction, as the quiet tension that had been building finally found its outlet, not in applause, not in confrontation, but in recognition. The woman in the aisle stood still for a moment, her arms slowly uncrossing, her posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either, caught somewhere between resistance and realization. "Then there must be a mistake," she said, but the conviction was gone, replaced by something thinner, something searching for ground that was no longer there. Danielle watched her without expression, not satisfied, not vindictive, just present, her gaze steady as the moment unfolded exactly as it needed to, because this was never about proving the seat, it was about revealing the assumption that came before it. The younger attendant stepped forward again, quieter now but clear. "We can help you find your assigned seat," she offered, and the phrasing mattered, not move, not remove, but find. And that shift in language marked the final turn, the point where the narrative could no longer be controlled by insistence. The woman hesitated once more, her eyes flicking briefly toward Danielle, not meeting her gaze fully, not apologizing, but no longer dismissing either, and in that small, almost imperceptible moment, the balance of the room settled completely, not because something loud had happened, but because something quiet had finally been said out loud, and could not be taken back. The resolution should have ended it, but it did not, because moments like this rarely end with truth alone. They stretch, they resist, they reveal what people choose to hold on to even after the facts are clear, and the woman in the aisle did not move right away, her feet planted as if stepping aside would mean more than just changing seats, as if it would confirm something she was not ready to accept. The lead attendant waited, her posture steady, giving space but not retreating, and the Younger attendant stood just behind her, quieter now but no longer uncertain, her earlier words still hanging in the air like a line that could not be crossed again. A few rows back, someone let out a soft breath that almost sounded like relief, and another passenger shifted in their seat, the tension no longer sharp, but still present, still watching. "There has to be another explanation," the woman said finally, her voice lower now, less certain, but still searching for ground. "I booked this seat months ago. I always choose 2A. It is consistent," and the way she said consistent carried more weight than the system itself, because it revealed the expectation she had been relying on all along. Danielle did not interrupt, did not challenge the statement, she simply listened, her gaze steady, allowing the words to reveal themselves fully, because this part mattered too, the part where justification turns inward, where people try to make sense of a reality that does not match what they assumed. The lead attendant responded carefully, her tone measured. "Seat preferences are noted, but assignments are finalized at booking confirmation," she said, and the explanation was simple, procedural, but it landed differently now, because it removed the last layer of ambiguity the woman had been holding onto. Still, she hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around the handle of her carry-on, her eyes moving briefly across the cabin, as if searching for agreement that was no longer there, and finding none. Her posture shifted again, not fully relaxed, but no longer confrontational, something in between, something quieter. Danielle adjusted her position slightly, not to reclaim space, but to settle into it more fully, her presence now undeniable, not because she had demanded it, but because she had never given it up. The younger attendant stepped forward once more, her voice gentle but clear. "Your seat is in row 3, on the aisle," she said, offering direction instead of correction, and that subtle shift in tone marked the final transition, from conflict to resolution, from challenge to acknowledgement. The woman glanced toward the indicated row, then back at Danielle, her expression unreadable for a moment, caught between something unspoken and something understood, and though no apology came, the absence of resistance spoke its own language, quieter, but just as real. She stepped aside at last, the movement small, almost ordinary, but in the context of everything that had just unfolded, it carried weight, because it was not just a step into the aisle, it was a step away from the assumption that had started it all. The lead attendant nodded slightly, signaling the shift without drawing attention to it, and the cabin responded in kind, not with applause, not with commentary, but with a subtle return to normalcy, conversations resuming in low tones, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins closing, the rhythm of the flight re-establishing itself. Danielle remained where she was, her gaze forward now, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the moment had passed through her without leaving a mark, but beneath that stillness was something more defined, not victory, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that does not need to be announced. As the woman moved toward her assigned seat, one final glance passed between them, brief, unspoken, and in that glance was the quiet understanding that nothing about this had been accidental, that what had happened was not about a seat at all, but about the assumptions that came before it, and the truth that followed. And as the aisle cleared and the last of the passengers settled in, the cabin seemed to breathe again, not because something had ended, but because something had been revealed and could not be unseen. The cabin returned to motion, but Danielle did not move with it right away. She remained still as the rhythm of the aircraft slowly reclaimed the space, as if she were allowing the moment to settle fully before letting it pass, and in that stillness something shifted inward, not visible to anyone watching, not spoken, but present. The low murmur of passengers adjusting their seats and fastening belts blurred into the background, and for a brief second, the sound seemed distant, like it belonged to another place entirely, because Danielle's mind had already stepped somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere quieter, somewhere familiar. She was 22 again, standing at a different gate, holding a ticket that had been printed twice because the first agent insisted something was wrong with it, her name checked and rechecked while others walked past without pause, the same tone, the same hesitation, the same look that asked a question without words. And she remembered how she had stood there then, explaining more than she should have needed to, just to prove she was allowed to move forward. The memory did not linger long, it never did, but it always returned at moments like this, not to weaken her, but to remind her, to sharpen the contrast between then and now, between being questioned and being certain, between asking for space and knowing she already occupied it. The present came back into focus as the lead attendant passed by again, slower this time, her expression composed but more aware, and she paused briefly beside Danielle's seat, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to say quietly, "Thank you for your patience," and the words were standard, procedural, but the tone carried something else, something closer to acknowledgement than apology. Danielle gave a small nod, not dismissive, not accepting in any performative way, just a recognition of the exchange, and then the attendant moved on. Her steps measured, her posture slightly more deliberate than before. Across the aisle, the older woman who had spoken earlier glanced over, offering a subtle smile, not wide, not intrusive, just enough to signal alignment, and Danielle returned it with the smallest shift in expression, a moment of shared understanding that did not require words. Further back, the young man who had questioned the situation leaned back into his seat, shaking his head slightly, as if processing what he had just witnessed, not with outrage, but with a quiet recalibration, the kind that changes how you see things the next time. Danielle adjusted the small tablet case at her side, her movements precise, unhurried, and for a moment, her reflection caught faintly in the window beside her, layered over the runway lights stretching out into the distance, a double image, present and past, clarity and memory. She looked at it only briefly before turning forward again, her gaze steady, because the moment was not about looking back, it was about what came next, and she already knew what that was. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, not quickly, not in reaction, but with intention, her thumb resting against the screen for a second before unlocking it, and as the display lit up, her expression did not change, but her focus did, narrowing slightly, becoming more precise, as if a different part of her had just stepped forward, one that had been present the entire time, waiting, observing, deciding. She did not dial immediately, did not open any app right away. She simply held the phone in her hand, letting the weight of the moment align with the decision she was about to make, because this was not about the seat, it never had been. And as the cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for departure, as the final announcements echoed softly through the overhead speakers, Danielle Brooks sat in 2A with the same calm she had shown from the beginning. But now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something deeper, the kind of stillness that comes right before something shifts in a way no one else in the room is prepared for. Danielle did not rush the moment. She let the cabin settle into its routine, let the illusion of normalcy rebuild itself around what had just happened, because that was how these spaces worked. They absorbed tension quickly, smoothed it over, pretended it had never existed, but she knew better. She had seen it too many times, felt it too many times. The quiet dismissal, the hesitation disguised as protocol, the assumption dressed up as procedure. Her thumb finally moved across the screen of her phone, unlocking it with a single motion, and instead of dialing immediately, she opened a secure app, one that did not sit on the front page, one that required intention to access, and as it loaded, her expression remained unchanged, calm, composed, but her focus sharpened, narrowing in a way that only someone used to making decisions under pressure would recognize. Across the aisle, the older woman who had offered the subtle smile earlier glanced over again, noticing the shift not in movement, but in presence. And there was something about the way Danielle now held her phone that felt different, not reactive, not casual, but deliberate. The younger attendant passed by once more, slower this time, her eyes briefly meeting Danielle's before moving on. And there was a flicker of recognition there, not of identity, but of gravity, as if she understood that whatever had just happened was not finished, only paused. Danielle tapped once, then again, navigating through layers that were not meant to be seen by most, and within seconds, a call request appeared. Not a standard contact, but a direct line, labeled only with a single word, executive, and she pressed it without hesitation. The connection did not ring, it opened, immediate, efficient, and a voice came through. Clear, professional, already alert. This is Carter Operations. And Danielle did not raise her voice, did not change her tone. She simply spoke, even, precise. Initiate internal review on Flight 782, first class boarding sequence, she said, her eyes forward, her posture unchanged. And there was no pause on the other end, no confusion, only readiness. Review initiated. Do you want full cabin log? The voice asked. And Danielle's gaze shifted slightly toward the front of the aircraft, where the lead attendant now stood speaking quietly with another crew member, unaware of the layer that had just been activated above her. Full log, passenger interaction, crew response, timestamp everything. Danielle replied, her voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying something else, something deeper, authority that did not need to be announced because it was already understood. Behind her, the young man who had questioned the situation earlier leaned forward again, his voice low as he spoke to the woman beside him. She is not just making a call, he said, more to himself than anyone else, and the woman nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Danielle's still form. "No, she is doing something bigger," she replied, and though they did not know what, they could feel it, the shift in energy. The quiet escalation that did not rely on volume. Danielle listened as the voice on the other end continued, "We are pulling crew identifiers now. Do you want escalation protocol?" And for a brief second, she did not answer, not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing the timing, the moment when action would not just correct, but reveal. Her mind moved quickly, not through emotion, but through structure, systems, accountability, the framework she had spent years building, refining, enforcing. And she remembered another moment, years ago, sitting in a boardroom where decisions like this were discussed in abstract terms, policy language, compliance metrics, but she had always insisted on something different: visibility, real-time accountability, consequences that were not delayed or diluted. She returned to the present without hesitation, her voice steady when she spoke again. "Hold escalation," she said. And the response came immediately, confirmed, holding, and she ended the call just as smoothly as it had begun. No hesitation, no excess movement. She placed the phone back in her lap, her hands resting lightly over it, her gaze forward once more, and from the outside, nothing had changed. She was still a passenger in seat 2A, still quiet, still composed, but beneath that stillness, something had been set in motion, something precise, something controlled, something that would not stay hidden much longer. And as the final boarding announcement echoed through the cabin, as the doors prepared to close, Danielle Brooks sat exactly where she had been from the beginning, but now the system she had built was quietly watching with her. The aircraft doors had not closed yet, but the atmosphere inside had already shifted into something quieter, more contained, as if the cabin itself was unaware that a second, invisible process had begun running parallel to everything else, something that did not rely on announcements or visible authority. Danielle sat still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly over her phone, but her awareness extended beyond the seat, beyond the aisle, into a system that was now quietly unfolding. In real time, and somewhere far from the runway, screens were lighting up, logs being pulled, timestamps aligning with voices that had not expected to be recorded in that way. The lead attendant moved through the aisle again, her steps practiced, her tone returning to standard procedure as she assisted another passenger with a bag. But there was a subtle tension in her movements now, something just beneath the surface, as if she could feel that the earlier moment had not fully dissolved, that it was still present, just out of sight. Danielle did not look at her directly this time. She did not need to, because she already knew what was happening beyond the cabin walls, the identifiers being matched, the interaction being flagged, the pattern being recognized not as an isolated moment, but as part of something larger. Something measurable. A soft chime sounded overhead, signaling final boarding, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting everything in a warmer tone, but the warmth did not reach the undercurrent of what had just begun. A man in the row behind Danielle shifted forward slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke again to the woman beside him. "Something about her is different," he said, and the woman nodded, her gaze steady. She never argued. She replied, and the observation lingered, because it was true. Danielle had not raised her voice, had not demanded, had not defended herself in the way people expected, and yet the outcome had shifted entirely around her. Further up the aisle, the woman who had been redirected to row 3 sat stiffly, her posture composed but not relaxed, her eyes fixed forward, avoiding the subtle glances that still moved in her direction, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed smaller, not in presence, but in certainty, as if something she had relied on without question had been quietly removed. Danielle's phone vibrated once, a small, controlled signal, and she glanced down briefly, the screen lighting up with a single line of text, "Review complete, awaiting directive," and that was all it said. No explanation, no detail, because none was needed. The system did not require repetition, it required decision. She did not respond immediately. She let the message sit, letting the timing align with the moment, because this was not about speed, it was about precision, about ensuring that what happened next would not just correct, but clarify. The lead attendant returned to the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with another crew member, her tone low, controlled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her posture now, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if she sensed that something beyond her control had already begun. Danielle lifted her gaze forward again, her expression unchanged, but her presence sharper now, more defined, and when she finally moved, it was small, deliberate, her thumb tapping once against the screen, sending a response that contained only 3 words: "Proceed with escalation," and the message disappeared as quickly as it had been sent, absorbed into the system that was already in motion. Nothing in the cabin changed immediately, no announcement, no interruption, no visible shift, but beneath that stillness, something had been activated, something that would not remain hidden much longer. And as the final preparations for departure continued, as the crew moved through their routines and the passengers settled into their seats, Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, composed, and completely in control of something no one else in the room had yet begun to understand. The announcement came softly at first, almost routine, a voice over the intercom requesting a brief delay before departure due to a system check, and most passengers barely reacted, assuming it was just another minor hold, another small inconvenience in a day of travel. But for Danielle, it was the moment where everything began to surface. The lead attendant paused mid-step near the front of the cabin, her hand instinctively reaching for the intercom panel as if she had not expected the message. Her eyes narrowing slightly as she listened to the follow-up instruction coming through her headset, and this time, there was no mistaking it. Her posture shifted from routine to alert, from control to uncertain. Danielle remained seated, her gaze forward, her breathing steady, but there was a quiet precision in her stillness now, the kind that does not come from patience, but from knowing exactly what is about to unfold. The younger attendant glanced toward her supervisor, confusion flickering across her face, because whatever was happening was not part of their normal procedures, not part of the scripted responses they had been trained to follow, and that difference was enough to unsettle the rhythm of the entire crew. A second announcement followed, this one quieter, directed only to the cabin crew, and though the passengers could not hear the words, they could feel the shift, the way the attendants moved differently now, the way their conversations shortened, their expressions tightened, as if something invisible had just entered the space and taken control. The woman in row 3 looked up, her earlier certainty now replaced with a subtle unease, her eyes moving toward the front of the cabin, then briefly back toward Danielle, as if trying to connect something she could not fully understand. Behind Danielle, the man who had been observing from the beginning leaned forward again, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is not about the seat anymore," he said, and the woman beside him nodded slowly, her gaze fixed ahead. "No, it is about something bigger," she replied, and neither of them knew how right they were. The lead attendant stepped into the galley area, her voice low but urgent as she spoke into her headset. "Can you confirm what this is regarding?" And this time, the response she received was not something she could deflect or reinterpret, because her expression changed instantly, her composure tightening in a way that made it clear the information she had just been given was not optional, not negotiable. She turned back toward the cabin, her eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Danielle, and in that moment, something clicked into place, not recognition of identity, but recognition of authority, the kind that does not announce itself, but reveals itself through action. Danielle did not react to the look, did not acknowledge it outwardly, but she felt the shift, the subtle recalibration of the room as the invisible structure she had activated began to intersect with the visible one. The intercom clicked again, and this time the voice was different, firmer, more direct, requesting the lead attendant by name to report immediately to the front for a priority communication, and the use of her name changed everything, because now it was personal, now it was specific, now it was undeniable. The cabin fell into a deeper quiet, not the casual silence of passengers waiting, but the attentive stillness of people sensing that something unusual was happening, something that did not fit into the normal flow of boarding and departure. Danielle adjusted her posture slightly, not to draw attention, but to settle more firmly into the moment, her hand still resting over her phone, her expression unchanged, but her presence now unmistakably centered in the unfolding situation. As the lead attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving forward, as if bracing for what she was about to hear, the tension in the cabin reached a new point, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, focused, like a line drawn just before it is revealed. And in that space, Danielle Brooks sat exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, composed, and now unmistakably at the center of something no one else had seen coming. The lead attendant returned from the front of the aircraft differently than she had left, and it was not subtle, not to anyone who had been paying attention, because her steps were no longer routine, they were measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of information that had already changed the outcome before she even spoke. The cabin sensed it instantly, the quiet shifting again, deeper this time, more focused, as if every person present understood that something irreversible had just taken place. She stopped in the aisle near Danielle's seat, not addressing the room, not making a general announcement, but positioning herself with a level of formality that had not been there before, her voice controlled but no longer neutral. "Ms. Brooks," she said, and the use of her name landed like a confirmation that traveled faster than any explanation, because now the identity that had remained unspoken was being acknowledged openly. Danielle lifted her eyes, calm as ever, meeting the attendant's gaze without surprise, without reaction, as if she had been expecting this exact moment from the beginning. The lead attendant straightened slightly, her tone shifting further, more precise now. "We have received confirmation from Executive Operations regarding your status and the earlier interaction," she continued, and though the words were formal, the effect they had on the room was immediate. A subtle ripple of realization moving through the cabin as passengers exchanged glances, connecting what they had witnessed with what was now being revealed. In row 3, the woman who had been redirected sat completely still, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed forward, but the color had drained from her expression, not dramatically, but enough to show that the certainty she had carried before was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to recognition. The younger attendant stood just behind her supervisor, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a focused awareness, as if she now understood the full weight of what had unfolded and her place within it. The lead attendant continued, her voice steady, but carrying a level of respect that had not been present before. "We are initiating a formal review of the boarding process and crew response on this flight," she said, and the phrasing was careful, structured, but the meaning was clear. This was no longer a moment that could be dismissed or forgotten. It was now part of a system that would be examined, recorded, and acted upon. Danielle listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, because this was not about hearing something new. It was about allowing what had already been set in motion to unfold in full view. A quiet murmur moved through the cabin, not loud, not chaotic, but filled with recognition, the kind that comes when a hidden structure suddenly becomes visible. The man behind Danielle leaned back slowly, shaking his head once, not in disbelief, but in understanding, while the older woman across the aisle lowered her gaze briefly before looking up again, her expression thoughtful, as if reassessing more than just what had happened in the last few minutes. The lead attendant took a small step back, her posture formal, almost deferential now. "If there is anything you require, please let us know," she added, and the sentence, simple as it was, marked a complete shift from the earlier tone of doubt and questioning, a shift that could not be undone. Danielle gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without expanding on it, because the moment did not require more words, it required presence. And she had maintained that from the start. In row 3, the woman finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough to adjust her posture, her gaze lowering briefly before returning forward, and though she said nothing, the silence carried its own weight, the absence of resistance now more telling than anything she could have said. The cabin remained quiet for a few seconds longer, the kind of silence that follows clarity, before the normal rhythm began to return once again. But this time it felt different, not because the environment had changed, but because the understanding within it had, and at the center of that shift, Danielle Brooks remained seated in 2A, calm, composed, and no longer just a passenger, but the quiet force that had turned an ordinary moment into something that would not be forgotten. The aircraft doors finally closed with a soft, definitive sound, and the cabin settled into that familiar stillness just before movement, the kind that usually carried anticipation, but now held something deeper, something reflective, because what had happened could not simply be folded away into routine. Danielle sat exactly as she had from the beginning, her posture composed, her gaze forward, but there was a quiet finality in her presence now, not because something had ended, but because something had been fully revealed. The engines began their low, steady hum, building beneath the surface, and as the plane slowly pushed back from the gate, the outside world shifted into motion, lights stretching into lines across the window, but inside, the impact of the moment lingered in a way that did not fade with distance. The lead attendant moved through the aisle one more time, her steps measured, her tone respectful in every interaction now, not exaggerated, not performative, but adjusted, as if something fundamental in her awareness had been recalibrated. And when she passed Danielle's seat again, she did not pause this time, but her posture carried acknowledgement without needing to repeat it. Across the aisle, the older woman folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful, her earlier quiet support now settled into something more internal, something that would likely stay with her long after the flight ended. Behind Danielle, the man who had observed from the beginning leaned back fully into his seat, exhaling slowly, his perspective no longer casual, no longer detached, because he had witnessed something that shifted how he would see moments like this in the future. not as isolated incidents, but as patterns that reveal themselves when allowed to play out. In row 3, the woman who had insisted on the seat sat still, her gaze fixed ahead, but her posture had changed, not in defeat, not in humiliation, but in awareness, the kind that does not announce itself, but quietly replaces certainty with reflection. And though she did not turn, did not speak, the distance between where she had stood and where she now sat carried its own meaning. Danielle adjusted her seat slightly as the aircraft began its slow taxi, her hand resting briefly on the armrest before returning to her lap, her movements calm, precise, unhurried, and for a moment, she allowed herself to look out the window, the runway lights passing in steady lines, a reminder that movement continues, that forward motion does not pause for moments like this, but carries them along. She did not smile, did not react outwardly, but there was a quiet certainty in her stillness, the kind that comes from knowing that justice does not always need volume, does not always need confrontation, sometimes it only needs presence, patience, and the willingness to let truth reveal itself completely. The cabin lights dimmed further as the safety demonstration began, voices steady, practiced, but beneath that routine, something had shifted permanently, not in the structure of the flight, but in the awareness of the people within it. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to settle the moment fully, to let it pass through without holding on to it, because this was not about carrying the weight of what had happened, it was about ensuring that it had been seen clearly, understood fully, and left in a way that could not be dismissed. As the aircraft lined up on the runway, engines building toward takeoff, the final stillness before acceleration filled the cabin, and in that space, Danielle Brooks remained exactly who she had been all along, not someone who needed to prove she belonged, not someone who needed to raise her voice to be heard, but someone who had built the very system that had just been used to question her, and then quietly used it to reveal the truth, not for recognition, not for applause, but because dignity, once challenged, deserves to stand on its own without ever having to ask for permission again.